from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. This is on Pew Bible, New Testament, page 8. This story is always the assigned gospel reading for the beginning of Lent. It's the story of Jesus tempted in the wilderness. And we all have different images come up when we think of wilderness. The burning sands of the Sahara, the rocky barren of the Southwest, the wild jungles of the Amazon, the frozen Siberian tundra, the middle of the vast ocean. Wilderness can make us think of areas devoid of people, sometimes devoid of life. Wilderness can be bleak and barren, and it can be teeming with dangerous creatures. Wilderness can be menacing and dangerous, or adventure-filled and exciting. Wilderness is vast and reminds us that we are small. Wilderness can be silent and empty, and it can be loud with the voices of nature, roaring waterfalls and howling winds, chirping birds and droning insects. How we understand wilderness is influenced by our experiences of wilderness in the past. Has wilderness been challenging or comforting? Our experience of wilderness is based on stories that we've heard from others. It's based on what we are hoping to find. Do we want adventure? Do we need comfort and rest? Do we go willingly or reluctantly? Lent is a journey into wilderness. Wilderness is our theme this Lent, and as we enter into these 40 days of Lent, we follow the path of Jesus, who also went into the wilderness. Hear the reading of God's word. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him again, "It is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor, and said to him, "All these I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Throughout his life, President Theodore Roosevelt found nature and wilderness to be a place of solace. When Roosevelt was 25 years old, both his first wife and his mother died on the same day. And so he left his 2-day-old daughter Alice with his sister, and he spent the next 2 years in the Dakota Territories. Later, after his first 2 terms in office were over, Roosevelt spent a year on safari in Africa. So in 1913, after being defeated in the polls as he ran for a 3rd term as president, Teddy Roosevelt and his son Kermit, along with Brazilian explorer Candido Rondon and a team of explorers, took an expedition down a previously unexplored river in the Amazon basin. Roosevelt had been frustrated with the Republican Party, with President Taft's leadership, and so he decided to run again for a 3rd term as the Bull Moose candidate during the 1912 election. And while he was campaigning in Milwaukee, he survived an assassination attempt, partly because the manuscript for his speech was so thick it slowed the bullet down. Teddy was eventually defeated in the polls by Woodrow Wilson. And so he was discouraged by his defeat, and he was still recovering from this bullet wound that he received. And so he was convinced by a friend to participate in this expedition in the Amazon. Disillusioned by the turn of events in his life, Teddy Roosevelt sought refuge in the wild unknown of the uncharted Amazon wilderness. The details of this expedition are recounted in a book called The River of Doubt. It's a fascinating story of wilderness survival. And from the very beginning, this trip seemed doomed to failure. Those in charge of buying supplies had purchased and brought all of the wrong things for the Amazon. The whole team suffered from malaria. One man was murdered by a fellow explorer on the trip. The team worried about what their interactions with indigenous tribes along this river would be like. Unlike other explorers, however, Rondon's men were under orders never to attack any of the natives, even if provoked. Rondon fiercely believed that peace begets peace. On this trip down the River of Doubt, Roosevelt himself almost died. On this trip to the Amazon basin, Roosevelt's search for solace turned into a fierce fight for survival. I think we're all fascinated by wilderness stories and survival stories. We love to hear about the resilience of the human spirit in extreme conditions. Wilderness stories are the ones that are best to tell. They're so dramatic. I have a few, some that I might share over the next few weeks, stories of events taking place in physical wilderness, stories of spiritual wilderness from my own life. And there are numerous TV shows and books and movies that depict survival stories of humans versus nature. The Revenant is a movie about frontiersman Hugh Glass. 27 Hours is about a mountain climber who gets trapped by a boulder. There are books like The River of Doubt and one called Alive, which is about a rugby team whose plane crashed on a glacier in the Andes. These are captivating stories. Even the best stories in the wilderness are The best stories in the Bible are wilderness stories. Hagar, the slave of Abraham and Sarah, goes into the wilderness not just once but twice. First to run away, and then as she is thrown out of Abraham's household. In this wilderness, Hagar meets God, and she is the only one in Scripture who dares to give God a new name. Hagar says, "You are El Roi, the God who sees me." Moses is out shepherding in the wilderness, and he sees a strange burning bush. He turns aside to see what it could be. The Israelites, of course, take refuge in the wilderness after they flee from Egypt, only to succumb to complaining and fear, and they spend the next 40 years wandering, led by a pillar of fire and cloud. Elijah, my favorite prophet, flees from Jezebel into the wilderness, and he meets God on the mountain as God passes by, not in fire or wind or earthquake, but in stillness. Even our first reading this morning from Genesis, the beginning of the whole human drama, eventually ends with the humans being cast out of the garden and into the wilderness east of Eden. Wilderness holds stories. Wilderness is where things happen. Jesus, in our story for this morning, is still dripping with the waters of baptism. His ears are still ringing with the words, "This is my beloved Son." And from baptism, Jesus is led straight into the wilderness by the Spirit. And sometimes, even as we profess that Jesus is fully human, we read this confrontation with the adversary as an inevitable victory. Jesus is also fully God, right? So of course he's going to win. As a kid, I was always confused as to why the devil even tried to tempt Jesus. The outcome was obvious. I read this encounter as a mere formality, that Jesus had to be tempted because all humans are tempted, but that for Jesus this was an easy encounter. I used to read this story as a high, cosmic, supernatural encounter between two powerful, otherworldly beings. But Hebrews 4 says we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. We have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. And as I've been thinking about this text, the story of Jesus in the wilderness, I've been thinking about wilderness and physicality. Rather than just being a conflict of person versus the supernatural, I focused a little more on the person versus nature aspect. Jesus surviving the rugged wild for 40 days and 40 nights, surviving to the point of starvation. For Jesus, this journey into the wilderness is not simply an easy test of wit and scripture. It is a grueling physical trial. At a certain point in life, we become familiar with how interconnected body and spirit are. When our bodies are suffering weakness or illness or pain, even something as simple as not getting enough sunshine, our spirits flag and falter. In these times, fear and despair invade more easily. And when we experience mental, emotional, or spiritual pain and trauma, these things often manifest in physical ways like headaches and stomach pain. Our bodies and our spirits are intimately connected. And so when we go into the wilderness, these wilderness experiences test us, body and spirit. And we prepare for it as best we can, but sometimes we find ourselves in the wilderness woefully out of our depth. Roosevelt and his crew had brought all the wrong supplies. Hagar was forced into the wilderness with only a skin of water. An entire generation of Israelites died in the wilderness because they chose fear instead of faith. But when we find ourselves in the wilderness and we have the courage to look around, the wilderness is where we find God. The God who gives generously. And the gifts we receive in wilderness may not be what we expect or what we think we need. Hagar receives a promise. Moses receives a commission. The Israelites receive bread and meat, fire and cloud. Elijah receives a companion. Jesus, too, receives angels, a company of angels who come and revive him. And so we look, we have faith to see what God would give to us. Wilderness is a place of testing and of solace. It holds both of these realities, danger and safety, despair and comfort, hardship and rest. It is no easy journey, and we may find ourselves in the wilderness for 40 days or 40 years. Here in this place, we will walk the wilderness road together over the next 6 weeks. And so we prepare ourselves for this journey by remembering the stories of our ancestors. Jesus, in this encounter with the adversary, girds himself with the Spirit and with Scripture. Jesus takes with him the presence of God and the words of past wilderness wanderers. And so we take these with us too. We ask the Spirit to lead us into the unknown on this path of wilderness. We take with us the words and stories of the people in the Bible, those who have wandered this path before. And we trust that we will find God and receive what God has for us. We are invited, as have so many before, to journey into this place of refuge and danger, of solitude and of communal memory. We are reminded through sand and branch, through stone and moss, that the wilderness is somewhere we've been before. The wilderness is a place to begin again. The wilderness is a place of mystery and the unknown. The wilderness is a place of new and resilient life. The wilderness is where we find God. May we find strength for the journey and courage to begin again in faith and hope. Let's pray. Spirit of we travel deep into the Lenten wilderness. Give us signs of your presence and experiences of comfort and hope. Prepare us for the ways we will be tested. Draw us closer to you. Give us stories for the road and bread for the journey. In the name of Christ, our leader and friend. Amen.